directly to Ilya Budraitskis, a Russian dissident and currently working at UC Berkeley. And he'll be reflecting on Russia after nearly 3 years of war in Ukraine. Although if you think about the Russian war on Ukraine, really since the takeover of Crimea, actually we're talking about more than a decade of war. So then Ilya will speak for 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and observations and an exchange. So this meeting is being recorded, and we're going to get started with Howie Hawkins. Howie.
Okay, thank you, Diane. So I went to Ukraine with the encouragement of members of Sotsialny Ruch, which is a democratic socialist organization there that I've been working with since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started in February 24th, 2022. And then the big protests broke out in Georgia against the foreign agents law last spring. So I got in touch with Greens and leftists and other pro-democracy activists in Georgia, and they encouraged me to get there to witness the election they had in October. And while I was there, since I was going all that way, I'd never been to Europe, I also stopped by several other countries to speak, mainly with Greens, to explain that Jill Stein does not speak for all Greens when it comes to solidarity with Georgia. So, what I went there to do is, first of all, express my solidarity with their struggles, and also, to report back and amplify their voices, particularly the Greens and socialists back here in the US, because so much of the commentary by people on the US left and the peace movement is based on a campus framework that tries to explain the conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine through a geopolitical analysis of state interests. And they regard US-led imperialism as the only imperialism in the world. And they end up justifying Russian imperialism in Georgia and Ukraine as self-defense against US-led Western imperialism. They don't make a class analysis of the people who are exploited and oppressed in these countries in order to figure out who we should be in solidarity with. And, people of the Democratic left in this country never appear in the podcasts and panels and articles of the campus. In fact, these people have never talked to, progressive activists in Georgia and Ukraine at all. And just to be clear who I'm talking about, celebrities like Vijay Prashad, Noam Chomsky, Medea Benjamin, Jeffrey Sachs, who are frequently platformed by progressive outlets like Common Dreams, about left and progressive organizations like the Party for Liberation and Socialism, their front group, the Answer Coalition, and the United Anti-War Coalition, who have organized demonstrations against solidarity with Ukraine. I'm talking about the campus wings of the Green Party and the Democratic Socialists of America. And I'm talking about the extensive, I call it post-left social media influencers like the Gray Zone and Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore. They brand themselves as progressive, but they've taken right-wing positions with campus conspiracist and anti-woke narratives. And unfortunately, these people are swamping our internationalist perspective of internationalism from below, of solidarity with peoples, not states. So I went over to Georgia and Ukraine to help give those people in the Democratic left there a voice in our debates here in the US. So I went to Georgia at the end of October to witness their parliamentary election on October 25th. And just a little background, the ruling Georgia Dream Party has become increasingly authoritarian and pro-Russian in recent years. And it's run by Georgia's richest man, a billionaire named Bidzina Ivanishvili. And polling shows consistently that the majority, over 80% in most polls, of Georgians want to join the EU. They see it as a way to protect their democratic rights and also their right to work in Western Europe, which is an important source of income based on remittances from migrant workers to their families back home. And over the last 2 years, a massive protest movement developed against a foreign agents law that was introduced by the Georgia Dream Party. It's based on a Russian law. They call it the Russian law in Georgia. And it's been used in Russia to suppress all political dissent and academic freedom in Russia. And the Georgia Dream, after the movement pushed it back last year, passed it in June. And so the opposition turned to the elections in October, hoping to throw out the Georgia Green Party and repeal the foreign agents law and other laws that Georgia Dream was passing. So as the election approached, Georgia Dream ran a very fear-based campaign. They said Russia would invade if the pro-European opposition won, like it did in Ukraine. And the Russian military already occupies 20% of Georgia, like it occupies 20% of Ukraine. So that scared some people into voting for the Georgia Dream, even though they didn't like it. The Georgia Dream then promised that they would ban opposition parties because they claimed that these opposition parties provoked Russia to invade and take that 20% of the land back in 2008. And then a month before the election, they passed an anti-LGBTQ law that was basically fear-mongering about so-called decadent Western values and trying to appeal to the socially conservative Orthodox Christians, particularly in the rural districts. Now, the opposition really didn't have anything in common except they opposed the Georgia Dream Party. And most parties in Georgia aren't parties like we think of them. They're really fan clubs around prominent politicians, is the way one Georgian described it to me. So I talked to a number of Marxian leftists about this, and they reject this EU versus Russia framework because they are well aware of the neoliberal requirements of the EU. They're not good for Georgia's development. And they point to the negative impact of foreign investors, capitalist investors from the EU, as well as Russia and China and Turkey. And they want Georgia to get past being just a transit hub for foreign capitalists. And that's not very different than Georgia's historic role during the Silk Road, where they were a stop between Europe and China from the 2nd century BC to the 15th century in the Christian era. And they also want to stop the final privatization of Georgian assets. Most of the companies have been privatized, but there remain natural resources in the country, particularly mining and mineral sites and sites for mega hydro dams. In fact, the biggest social movement in Georgia history until what's going on now was a movement against mega dams in the Rioni Valley, particularly the Namak Vani Dam. And that dam would drown 18 villages, ancient villages in a region where winemaking was invented 8,000 years ago. And that movement scared off the original principally Turkish investors in 2021. And the Georgia Dream claimed that this movement was organized and funded by Western intelligence services and USAID and so forth. In fact, the movement was funded by small donations from the Georgian people, including the Georgian diaspora of migrant workers in Western Europe who would send regular small remittances to this movement. One of these Georgian Marxists I talked to, Lila Rekviashvili, has documented this funding in her books and articles. And the Greens in Georgia arranged a meeting for me with the leaders of this movement, and they said they got the bank records to prove it. But what the Georgia Dream did was say, this foreign influence is, wrecking our plans for development of the country. Therefore, we need the foreign agents law to stop this Western interference. And these leaders said, we understand that, the EU is no panacea for us. And they pointed out that even though the U.S. is sanctioning Bidzina Ivanishvili, the billionaire, and other Georgia Dream leaders, at the same time, they're trying to recruit new investors for this dam project. So Another thing to note is that the labor movement in Georgia is very weak. It's to the extent people are in unions, they're still kind of like the old Soviet style unions tied to the government. So they're not much help in these movements. But these grassroots environmental movements against the dam and mining sites are powerful. And that's what, forced the Georgia Dream to, or encourage them to pass or adopt this foreign agents law. The other thing the socialist left in Georgia tries to draw inspiration from is the fact that the first elected socialist government in the world was in Georgia, the Democratic Republic of Georgia from 1918 to 1921. And they lost power in 21 because they were from the Menshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and the Bolsheviks overthrew them. So, but it's a model they look back to and use to explain to other Georgians who are scared, the left to them is Stalinism, Soviet Union, that it doesn't have to be that way. So the official results were 54% for the ruling Georgia Dream Party and 46% for the opposition parties. And the socialists and the Greens I was meeting with were shocked and they were devastated. And in fact, several of them literally got sick with headaches and flu-like symptoms and had to cancel meetings for a few days. Some of them have been election observers with the OSCE and domestic groups, and they reported a lot of election rigging, mainly voter intimidation tactics like non-secret votes where you could see how people voted because the boxes were transparent, and Georgia Dream thugs just patrolling polling sites, which really mattered in the small towns and rural areas where your access to jobs and public services depends on the local party bosses of the Georgia Dream Party. They said it was not as bad as Venezuela where the numbers were made up, but it was enough intimidation to give Georgia Dream the official victory. The OSCE issued a negative report on the elections, and the European Parliament voted overwhelmingly not to recognize the result and call for new elections. So I was there when this happened, and there was a demonstration called on Monday after the Saturday election. And as I was walking down the main thoroughfare to the Parliament building where the demonstration was gathering, and there were hundreds and maybe thousands of people on the street with me, I happened upon the Hungarian strongman Viktor Orban, who was in town to congratulate and support the Georgia Dream government. And he was exiting a Marriott hotel to a convoy of SUVs, and the crowd spotted him. And they immediately started booing and hissing and started chanting Orban Wilo, which is a Ukrainian chant, which they use against Putin. It roughly translates into Orban is a dickhead. And so that was interesting. I showed that video when I got to Ukraine. Ukrainians loved it. They all wanted a copy. So they say 100,000 people were there. I believe that. And the demonstrations continued, but they kind of petered out. And the movement, the opposition wasn't sure what to do. But then at the end of November, the Georgia Dream government said they were suspending talks on accession to the EU for 4 years. And the protests exploded, not just in Tbilisi, the capital where they usually are, but in cities and even small towns all over the country. And they've got worse because the government has been very repressive, beating people, arbitrary arrests, sometimes by people who are not in uniform. And so there are a lot of political prisoners now. And these demonstrations were massive for 40 days. And over the New Year's and Orthodox Christian Christmas, which is in early January, the movement waned a bit, but it got started up this last week, and they're trying to build a general strike of labor and businesses against the regime. And we'll have to see how that works out. But the two immediate demands, and these movements are not organized by the opposition parties. They're just people on the street, and lots of informal and sort of ad hoc organization going on. But the two clear immediate demands are clear: new elections and free the political prisoners. So I don't have enough time to talk about the history of the Green Party in Georgia, which is very interesting, influential in the early years, divided these years. But basically, one of the Greens became the environmental minister, And the Greens had been very active in the movement for democracy and independence in the later Soviet period, the late 1980s, and basically wrote the environmental laws, which these environmental movements are today using to block these mines and dams. So there is a real movement there. It's just not linked to the Green Party, which has 3 different factions, which I just don't have time to go into. So then I went to Ukraine. And as soon as I got there, there was an air raid siren. And Sociální ruch, or the social movement in English, who hosted me, they took me right away to a meeting of the East European Left Alliance for the People and the Planet, which is a new formation of the left parties in Europe who are in solidarity with Ukraine. And it was interesting. The first guy who saw me greeted me. His name is Jonas Jostedt. He's with the Swedish Left Party. He's a member of the European Parliament. And he said he had met me at a Green Party campaign meeting when I was running for governor in New York. And I didn't remember that. But now he's the, according to Sociální ruch, the best ally they have in the European Parliament. So I observed their meeting, and they're talking about Ukraine, and it was refreshing to hear them talk about how can we best arm Ukraine, not whether we should. And these people are different from some of the other left parties. The Linke had their new co-chair there as an observer, and that's because Sarah Wagenknecht, took this right-wing group out of the Die Linke, so they're kind of rethinking their perspective on that. And then after talking about how to arm Ukraine, they said, let's talk about diplomatic initiatives. And they focused on how to strengthen the oil sanctions. And they focused on the shadow fleet of tankers that are shipping Ukrainian oil. And within a few weeks of that time, they got a resolution passed in the European Parliament. And in fact, the US is now even focused on that. So, that was very encouraging. And I'll just say, Sociální ruch is only about 100 activists, but they punch way above their weight. I mean, their chapters, and I met them in Kyiv, Kryvyi Rih, and Lviv, have a steady stream of activity, much of it consisting of educational work and mutual aid projects. They're well integrated with the labor and feminist and environmental movements, and they're respected in these movements. I met with Svetlana Romanko with Razum We Stand, which is focused on strengthening oil and gas sanctions against Russia and rebuilding Ukraine with renewable energy. She worked for 350 in Ukraine and the Caucasus and Central Asia for years, and then formed Razum We Stand when the full-scale invasion started. And when I told her that Sociální ruch was hosting me, she was very happy about that. She said they're reliable and very smart. So that's just to show the kind of respect they have around different parts of the Ukrainian progressive movements. So I met with the Kyiv chapter first, and Dennis Pilash, who I know many of you know, hosted me the first week. He has 2 apartment mates in his flat who are in the military. One of them was on leave for a week, so I had a room there for the first week. And I think the second day I was there, we heard this explosion, and it turned out to be Taras Shevchenko National University, where Dennis teaches political science. So he had to take all his classes online that week and spend a day over there helping to physically, move the rubble out of the way. So what I talked to when I talked to all 3 of the chapters is, first of all, I just thanked Sociální ruch for, their clear analyses of what's going on in Ukraine and the need for a real international solidarity. I mean, their stuff, I think, puts most of what we write in this country to shame. And I told them that. And I explained to them the campus versus internationalist debates in the US, and that Jill Stein isn't speaking for all the Greens. And, they're very unhappy with Jill Stein. Vladislav Starodubstev, who I know some of you know, said Jill Stein is trying to get us killed. And I said, well, I don't think she's trying to get you killed, but what she's saying might get you killed. They set up meetings for me with construction workers and atomic workers union leaders, particularly with the atomic workers. I was working with Dennis Bondar for an article he was writing that Posley just published about these 10 missing Zaporizhia atomic workers that the Russians have, and they're incommunicado. So all that's to say that they're very well integrated into the movements. Then I went to Kryvyi Rih, and this is the local where, the blue collar workers are. They're the most class conscious group of workers I think I've ever met. When I spoke to them, there's a veterans union, and they wanted to emphasize to me that it was the self-organization of rank and file soldiers and voluntary citizens who really prevented Russia from taking a lot more land, stopped the attempt to take over Kyiv, and stop them on the Eastern Front in the Donbass. And they're highly critical of the political and military leadership in Ukraine. I mean, they said there are 5 million arms circulating in Ukraine. And if, the oligarchs and the military commanders, don't get their act together, they might take, hands and things into their own hands. And I said, you mean like the armed forces movement in Portugal in 1974? And they said, no, we have our own tradition. Nestor Makhno during the Russian Revolution in Ukraine, the anarchist communists who fought with the Red Army against the White Army, but then the Red Army turned on them, and they were fighting for autonomy of Ukraine and the autonomy of their Soviets, their communes, where they were already redistributing the land. And so Yuri Samoylov, who was the head of the Independent Miners Union, said he would take me to the balcony where Nestor Makhno used to give speeches during that period. And that morning we were headed over there, and I heard this explosion too. A missile hit an apartment block right near that balcony, and so the area was blocked off. So Yuri took me on a tour of the mines and the slag heaps, and it's sort of reddish, Martian-like landscape. And he said, see, the Ukrainian miners got to Mars before Elon Musk did. So he had a lot of stories. He knew the Zelensky family, and he said the grandfather was a brutal Stalinist who kicked him out of the youth communist organization, Common Soul, for being a decadent Western hippie. And Yuri is a new lefty. He supported the Prague Spring and things like that. And he said he knew more Marx than any of his, adult leaders in Common Soul. And he said Zelensky's father was a, standard issue Soviet Marxist-Leninist, but that Volodymyr was ambitious, and that his campaign was like Donald Trump's. It was a branding exercise. He didn't expect to win, but things turned out differently. But Yuri has a very revolutionary perspective. He thinks and he wants a Ukrainian revolution to spark a Russian revolution and, get things straight there. And he talked about Socialny Ruch aspiring to be a party. And I was hosted there by his daughter, Sniza Olekson, who's the new head of Socialny Ruch. And she took me to a school where she teaches classes. The classes are held in basements because of the fear of shelling and drone strikes and missile strikes. And then after school, she teaches English. One class of elementary students I witnessed, a later class of high schoolers, in the storefront of Socialny Ruch. And then in Lviv, that chapter has a more youthful and feminist character. They hooked me up with the feminist workshop, which I know many people have heard about. They had me listen in on a class on organizing. One of the slides was interesting. It showed the Black Panther Party storefront, and they talked about the community services they were doing and how that is an important part of organizing. And also arranged a meeting with an organization of wives of soldiers who, really want the government to set up fixed terms of services for soldiers and to have more regular rotations off the front line. And they argue that that will improve the mobilization. And then probably one of the highlights is I got to meet Taras Billis, who I know many of you know. He got the Daniel Singer Prize. He's been writing articles on the need for a new international system that can protect smaller nations like Ukraine from big predators like Russia. He wrote, the day after the invasion, a letter to the Western left, and then he joined the Territorial Defense Forces. Now he's in the Ukrainian Armed Forces. And I met him after Trump won, and he was depressed. He sees it as a big victory for Putin and the far right in Europe. And he was saying, I was hoping the left would take up this international security question and get something done in years. Now he's afraid it's going to take decades. And then I got to ask him, because at the Socialist Conference in September, at the end of his presentation, which was over Zoom, he finished his last question by saying the U.S. left should not try to lobby Biden about Ukraine. And I wondered, what did he mean by that? So I asked him, and he said that because he knew it would be divisive on the left because of our campus versus internationalist debates. And he said Solzhenitsyn Rukh had to set aside a debate on how to deal with the Minsk Accords and what was going on in Donbass because they had different positions, in the teens after the initial invasion in 2014 until 2022, when everybody, it was clear to everybody they had to organize defense. And I was kind of dumbstruck that he was worried about the health of the U.S. left with all he is facing in Ukraine. And unfortunately, I can report that he got wounded last week. He got shrapnel in his leg. He works with a drone reconnaissance unit, and he went out to fix an antenna, and some ordnance hit nearby, and he expects to fully recover, but it just shows what he's facing. And the fact that he was worried about our status was incredible. So I'm about up with my time, huh? So there's so much I could report on Poland, Czechia, the European Greens Congress, but I'll just, come to the conclusion, which I think was repeatedly emphasized to me by people in Georgia and Ukraine, as well as Poland and Czechia in Eastern Europe. And what the international left says about these struggles over there is very important to them. Support, boosts their morale. They really appreciate it. And they're in small countries that Russia believes it has a right to dominate as part of its sphere of influence. So it's important for them to know that they have allies around the world. And the other thing that's important for them is that it helps them politically within their countries because the left in Georgia have to deal with the legacy of Stalinism and 4 centuries of colonization by the Russian Empire and the exploitive and repressive legacy of Stalinism in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And if the international left is perceived by the publics in those countries as pro-Russian and pro-Stalinism, pro-Soviet, the domestic left has a hard time even getting a hearing. But if the international left is perceived as pro-democracy and against Russian imperialism, it helps them speak to the broader publics in their country. So, as I said, I think at this point it's pretty clear the campus left is swamping the internationalist left in social media and in the streets in this country, which means, we've got to get our internationalist solidarity viewpoints out there in a much stronger way.
Thanks, Howie, and I'm sure some of what you want to say may come up in the discussion. So now we're going to move to Ilya, who can tell us a little bit about looking at it from the point of view of a Russian dissident.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Howie, for your report, and I think it was a great experience and a great way to express your support to our comrades in Georgia and Ukraine in this difficult moment. So probably in my short presentation, I will try to focus on 3 things. So the first one is upcoming negotiations between Russia and US. And I just wanted to say that I think that if these negotiations will happen in some coming weeks, it will lead to a failure. So I don't see any way how this deal could be managed by Trump, because I think that Trump and let's say his team, they still don't understand the real stakes of Putin and his regime in this war. So Trump is still thinking about this war in terms of the regional conflict. Okay, there is some part of the world where there is a regional power called Russia, which has some problems with the current border of Ukraine. So that's the main base of this deal, for this possible deal for Trump. And for Putin, this war is not about Ukrainian territory. It's not even about the Ukrainian government. It's not just about the control over Ukraine. It's about the role of Russia in the European architecture, like in general. It is about redistribution of power in the world, and especially in Europe, and that's about the future and the very existence of his own regime, because when Trump was talking about new sanctions, that Putin has some problems with Russian economy, so we will make more pressure on him with the new sanctions on oil, on the shadow fleet, and so on. And that's why Putin will be afraid of these sanctions, because it could probably affect his popularity inside the country, as happened, according to Trump psychology, as happened with Biden and the question of inflation in the US. So that's absolutely a wrong way to understand what Putin gained inside Russia with the start of this war, because what was happened, that the whole regime turned into an open repressive dictatorship, and the whole legitimacy of Putin is now based not on his popular support, not on any elections, not on economy, let's say, but it's based on war, and the Putin as the wartime leader in the moment of the existential threat for the very existence of Russia as a state. That's the way how Putin presented his power inside the country, and that's why I mean, of course, Russia has some problems with economy, but these problems are not so. So first of all, they are not so big that they will stop Putin to continue this war, at least for coming year or even 2 years. And secondly, there is no any protests in the country, even on the basis of some decrease of the life level and so on. So of course you have an inflation, you have the decrease of the living standards, you have the increase of poverty, you have hundreds, thousands of Russian soldiers who were already killed in this war, but all of this don't challenge Putin's power inside the country, unfortunately. So that's why the question of sanctions is absolutely not the way how to make pressure on Putin to make any deal in Ukraine, and especially in the current situation where you see some very slow but progress for the Russian troops. And what is more important, that Putin personally, he believes that Russia is slowly winning in this war, whatever it means. But Russia is going more and more close to a victory in this war. So that's why he's absolutely not interested in freezing the current front line, and he is not interested in this deal proposal coming from Trump for a moment. So the second thing that I was going to focus on is the Russian economy. So I will tell about it very briefly. So inflation. So definitely you have a increase in inflation in Russia, but it's not according to Russian standards and according to, let's say, historical experience of Russians who survived so-called market reforms in the 90s and so on. The current rate of inflation is not so high. So you can imagine that in the late 90s, inflation in Russia was about 80%, and people survived somehow. And the government, Yeltsin's government at that time, was not overthrown. So for the last year, the official rate of inflation in Russia was about 10%. And unofficially, it seems that it was like in between 10 and 20. So it's definitely high, but it's not critical for, let's say, political stability of the regime. So the second moment, which is very important, so look at the recent budget of Russia that passed in the Russian parliament last December. Altogether, like military expenses and so-called national security expenses, so altogether they occupied more than the half of all the Russian budget. You can imagine that the expenses for education and healthcare nearly five times less than expenses for the army and so-called national security. And what is interesting actually that the expenses for the national security, which means like policing, like secret services and so on, they are nearly the same as the military expenses. So you can imagine what level of repressive control like Putin installed inside the country. So, but what is the most important about the Russian budget, that only 30% of this recent Russian budget depends on oil and gas export. So 70% of the Russian budget come not from the oil and gas export, but it comes from, let's say, expropriation of the Russian citizens. It comes from taxes, from fines, from various types of expropriation of the common people by the state in the times of war. So probably the last thing that I want to focus on is the current state of the Russian society and the level of support for the war and for regime in general. So even for now, you can say that you have a massive enthusiastic support for this war. And despite the very active and very aggressive efforts of the Russian government to indoctrinate the Russian society, the people they are still passive. So the only way to recruit new soldiers for the Russian army is to offer really big money for the military service. So that's the only way how Putin is still managing this war and his army. But definitely the regime is trying to indoctrinate the society to um, uh, bring more ideology, like aggressive imperialist nationalist ideology in this various spheres of public of private life, like education, and so on. So, for example, I just recently watched a video about the new patriotic education in the children garden. So you can imagine that like kids who are just I don't know 5 years old or even less, they now obliged to think patriotic songs in their school and in their children garden. But still, you can say that the part of society which is really affected by this pro-war and militaristic and nationalist propaganda is still a minority. And you have a very big hidden, let's say, level of dissatisfaction with the war. It's hard to say how this dissatisfaction and when it could um, um, transfer or transit to any type of the open political protest, but even for now, you can see how people in Russia who are directly affected by the war. So especially, for example, evidence of Kursk area in the south of Russia. That's the area which is partially occupied by Ukraine, and people there on the territory controlled by Russia, on a territory controlled by Ukraine, they are really now suffering by this war on the same level as many Ukrainians. So they are living in they survive through heavy bombing and so on, and sometimes even from bombing coming from the Russian troops. But now even this smaller part of the Russian population directly affected by the war is already heavily dissatisfied with the ongoing war. And during last months, there were a number of spontaneous protests of this evidence of the Kursk area in the south of Russia, who are especially dissatisfied because they didn't get any compensation for their homes, which were destroyed mostly by the Russian artillery. And there were a number of very impressive protests there. So probably I will stop. I will stop here, and I really will appreciate any of your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Both contributions have been so important in giving us a sense of what's going on. And it's now time for your questions or comments. And if you could raise your hands in the under the react button, or put stack in the chat. I may not be able to see you, so somebody else can mention that your hand is up, and I'll try to call on people as I see them. And I think let's just try to keep our questions or comments to a couple of minutes, and we'll after 3 or 4 questions, then maybe we can go back to the presenters and get more information. So I think I see David Finkel's hand up. David?
Right. Hi. Thanks for both presentations. I mean, there's a lot in Howie's report that is inspiring, encouraging, and so forth. The question really is just against the overwhelming weight of the Russian offensive. The fact that they have held out the way they have, and even taken back territory that Russia initially took, is remarkable. It's really fantastic, especially since I know that the ingenuity of the soldiers in the field isn't necessarily matched by the skill of all the commanders. But the question is, how long can they really hold out? And I suppose the big unknown is, how much assistance will they continue to get from the United States and the European Union, because European countries are not in good shape economically for the most part, and they're also politically rather fractured. Just, the question of whether they can survive such an onslaught, indefinitely, or, for another year anyway. So I'd appreciate comments from either Howie or Ilya about your perceptions of that.
Bill?
Yes, thank you both for excellent informational presentations. For Howie, talking about international solidarity, was there, I won't ask so much about Georgia, but in Ukraine, was there any awareness of the efforts of the Fourth International with the World Congress coming up? I know it's not a major player, but was there some sense of knowing the efforts that have been made? And for Ilya, the question is, how do you see this playing out, the war playing out for Russia in regard to their allies, and especially China, and what they're hoping to get out of it, that is their allies, and can they play a major role? Thank you.
Palamich?
Yeah, thank you, Ilya and Howie, for your excellent presentations. I could listen to the rest of that for the next 5 hours. I love your analysis. The question I have is more of a military question, which doesn't really get talked about in the U.S. press much. That is the impact of my dogs are barking. Hey, hush! Sorry. My dog's in the background. And that is really the innovation by the Ukrainian military over the Russian military in terms of their ability to sustain, if not offensive, at least defensive actions. And I'm bringing this up because in the Western media, most of the understanding of Ukrainian fights are focused on battles and not on strategy, logistics, or the kind of larger capacities that actually defeat an opponent, as we saw in World War II and elsewhere. So anyway, maybe that could be addressed, the issue, the strategic question of how is Russia actually able to carry on the war, given the fact that their refineries are being bombed, their production plants are being bombed, not unlike what we saw in World War II with the ball bearing factories being eliminated and the Messerschmitt plants being eliminated as well, which allowed which made the Nazi war machine unable to field the equipment it needed to defeat the Americans or the French or the Soviets. And so I guess what I'm asking for Ilya probably, and maybe Howie, is to what degree does this defensive military strategy built on attrition actually become successful, regardless of the politics between Trump and Putin, or even the left? And is it possible that attrition strategy and defensive strategy can win over the long run here? And we're not talking about maybe 6 months, we're talking maybe a couple of years here. So I'll leave it at that.
Wow.
Sorry about the dogs.
We didn't hear them much. Now I hear them. Okay.
Yeah.
If there's no further question, I'm going to turn it back first to Howie and then to Ilya. And then you can be thinking up another set of questions. So not seeing any hands, I'm going to ask Howie.
Well, in the Fourth International, nobody mentioned it, although Yuri Samoylov, the head of the miners' union, made a point of saying that Trotsky grew up near Kryvyi Rih in Ukraine. So he was familiar with Trotsky, but he didn't talk about the Fourth International, nor did anyone else. On the military question, I think, the narrative we're getting, and Russia really pushes this hard, is that they're winning. But if you look at what they gained this year at the cost of hundreds of thousands of people, is 1% of Ukraine's land. Ukraine has taken back half the land that Russia initially had, although they got most of it in 2022, and it's been pretty much a stalemate since. And I'm not a military analyst, so I have to go, based on what I've been reading from those people who are trying to do that. And one of the people I find has had a good record and is more optimistic than most of the narratives is Phillips O'Brien. And he points out, that Russia's had this long, hard slog this year at the cost of hundreds of thousands of troops to get a little bit of land, that even without getting permission from the U.S. to, use long-range missiles on Russian territory, Ukraine has done it with their own homemade drones. And it is having an impact on their oil refining capacity, their military production capacity, where they can take off from. The big weakness is they haven't found a way to stop the glide bombs, which are, like 2,000-pound bombs that are old ordnance they put wings on, and they launch them, and they're not that accurate, but they're very devastating whatever they hit because they're such big bombs. And that's where the F-16s can play a role. But Ukraine only has, a dozen of them at this point? So I think another thing that, was emphasized, Dennis Bondar in some recent discussion I think we had online said, what do you admire most about the Ukrainian people? He said the resilience and innovation. And I think this war has shown that. So can they hold out? They think they can. Most of the people I talk to, including people in the military and that veterans union, those folks, they said two things. One is 90% of us want this war to end. We want to go home. We're tired. But they also said going to stop resisting the Russian invasion. And that's where they turn to, we need better policies from the government in terms of how soldiers are recruited, how they're treated, and how strategy or tactics at the local level is implemented. You know, that's where they emphasize that the soldiers on the ground know the best tactics, not these military commanders who learned from the Soviet playbook. So that's the best I can tell you. I think they can hold out, but it's going to cost them. Like it's costing the Russians a lot more to try to take land. But it seems they're able to hold the land. There's some key cities like Provost is next, and they've lost some others, this year, but it hasn't resulted in a big breakthrough. And I haven't seen anybody really predict that except the Russians and their apologists. So that's the best I can say.
Thanks, Ilya.
Thank you for your questions. So probably I will start with the question about if Ukraine could stay for one more year or not, because from the very beginning, the Russian strategy was not just a military strategy. It was not just about how to take as much as possible of Ukrainian territory by use of the army, but it was mostly military political. It was about how to change the regime in Ukraine by making the price of this war so high for the ordinary Ukrainians. So for now, you see that Putin, like he officially refused of any possibility of direct talks with Zelensky, or even with the presence of Zelensky in some possible peace negotiations, because Zelensky, according to Putin, is not a real president, is not legitimate president of Ukraine anymore, and Russia is more rely on growing dissatisfaction of Ukrainians with ongoing war and with unpopular decisions of the government, including the most painful question of the recruitment age for the army, because now you know that US government especially, and some European governments as well, they're making pressure on Ukraine so that Ukraine should reduce the recruitment age up to 18 years, and now it's 25. So of course Zelensky doesn't want to do it, especially because it will destabilize his government. Yeah, it will be extremely unpopular, and I think that Russia is trying to combine military and political strategy even by now. Yeah, so in this way, it's very hard to predict the real political outcomes of such possible decisions of Ukrainian government. Yeah, so about Russia and China, of course, it's very complicated question, and you know that That's one of the possible strategies for Trump to talk to China directly. Not just trying to solve the Ukrainian conflict with Putin directly, but to discuss it with China as the main sponsor of Russia. And I think it's also problematic because, well, you can say that Russia is very much dependent on China, but I think that the political stakes for Putin is so high that he couldn't just follow some orders coming from China, like to freeze the current front line in Ukraine.
Thanks to both of you. I see Sam has his hand up.
I do. Thank you. Great talks. Thank you very much for all the insights. I'm in touch with Ukrainians on a, I'm going to be talking to Ukrainians 3 times this week, basically, and work with a lot of them very closely. And one of the, these are public health frontline Ukrainian people in terms of public health, rather than politicos. And one of the things I have seen grow since 2014 is their hatred of Russia. Not Russians, but Russia. And I'm sure there's a certain amount of parallel feeling among many Russians towards Ukraine. And that is creating a situation where any form of anything other than a stalemate is going to be very hard to organize. Which raises the question in my mind of where are the dynamic elements in the world situation that might be able to end this, similar to the kinds of questions people asked during World War I, in a sense. And, the most powerful dynamic situation in some ways is the destabilization of the entire world economy and political situation that Trump may produce, whether he likes it or not. And it's unclear whether that will lead and where it will lead to movements from below that threaten the stability. Because, one of the things, my analysis of Putin's actions since 2014 is that it's very much been driven by a fear of movements from below. And so that, the Maidan movement was absolute anathema to him. The stuff in Georgia now is anathema to him. And for good reason, because he understands that his regime, even as a police state, is relatively shaky. So my question, in a sense, is what do you see as the dynamic processes and forces going on that may actually let us shake things up in a way that makes the twin evil regimes of Ukraine and Russia things that may get overthrown and lead to some possible motion and solution to some of these problems from below?
Thanks, Sam. I don't see another question, so I'm going to ask one of my own, and then perhaps somebody else will have the courage to raise their hand. I wanted to ask a question about the attitudes of Ukrainians and Ukrainians from different ethnic groups toward the Russian folks in the eastern part of Ukraine. How has that changed at the course of the war? I remember one of the people who spoke at the Socialist Conference a couple of years ago said that she was afraid that the Russian invasion would harden Ukrainian attitudes towards the Russian minority in Ukraine. And I'm wondering if that's happened or if there have been other dynamics, such as seeing the brutal way the Russian military has treated those areas that they have taken over, and if that's had any other impact on Ukrainians. So that's my question. Is there another question or comment that people would like to make?
Yeah, I raised a hand, Diane.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Kim.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I have a question about the situation of being an activist inside of Ukraine right now. And I should have said at the beginning, both presentations were terrific, so thank you very much. Because I know you said the labor movement is not very strong. I would imagine that labor action that actually interferes with production would meet a sort of a tidal wave of you know, a variant of McCarthyism, right? You're aiding the enemy by taking any kind of job actions. And I'm also wondering about the extent to which that weighs down on political protest movements of almost any kind inside of Ukraine. Because trying to mobilize a population when you're not just at war, but you're in the country that's being invaded is politically quite dangerous. It's quite fraught, right? So I'm just wondering, to the extent that they're facing that, how comrades in Socialny Ruch are trying to deal with that.
Howie, can you help us here? A couple of the questions have been really about attitudes,
Yeah,
possibilities.
sure. Well, I didn't hear anybody, and you got to remember, I was hosted by people on the left, so I didn't have a scientific sample. But I did, meet people who were not in the left. Like when I rode the train from Kyiv to Lviv, I was in a compartment. There were 4 of us. 2 of them were soccer referees, football referees, who were going to referee a game in far western Ukraine, coming from Kyiv. And they were ethnic Russians from the Donbass. And they wanted me to really understand that Russia started this thing. And one of them, named Dima, said, he worked for the courts in Donetsk City. And the Russians seized the government buildings, and he had to flee. His father had to flee too. He was a cop. And the father went to Mariupol. And then he had to flee when the Russians attacked that. He's now in Dnipro. And this Dima, he went to Dnipro first, and then he went to Kyiv, where he works the same kind of job in the courts in Kyiv. And he just wanted me to be able to tell people that, Russia came in and screwed everything up, including screwed up the Russian people, ethnic Russians, and most people speak Russian. In fact, when I was in Kyiv and Dnipro, they were speaking Russian almost all the time. In Lviv, it was more Ukrainian. And, they switched back and forth, but it was never an issue. So I think, as I think Sam said, not so much against Russians as, people, but the Russian government, the Russian state is what they're really, really angry about. So that's my impression on that. As far as, activism, you know, the people on the left, like labor, labor's much stronger in Ukraine than it is in Georgia. That's where I said it was really weak. In Ukraine, it's a force. It has influence. It has some, you know, leaders who are in their Rada, their parliament. And, you know, they have organizations. They have two union federations. One's kind of inherited the Soviet Federation, and then there's another federation of independent unions. But they cooperate a lot on statements. So, and they, you know, like when I was talking with Yuri Samoilov of the miners union, he was telling me about a strike. You know, most of the miners now are women because the men are fighting on the front line. But he said even before the full-scale invasion, they had a strike in 2020 in the iron ore mines. And he said the women, it was on the shoulders of the women. They really organized it, it kept it together, and kept everybody's spirits up. Now they seem to accept that they can't go on strike, but they can, you know, like they're fighting the Rada right now over another change in the labor codes, which is in a more neoliberal direction. And they've got some amendments passed, and, you know, so they do have influence. There are street protests, you know, or demonstrations, you know, LGBTQ parades. There's a lot of protests, you know, of or demonstrations of the wives of soldiers, you know, wanting better rotation, better benefits for veterans. So there is political activity going on. So I don't think, you know, there's so much unity against the Russians that the state isn't going to crack down on most of it because it's not, you know, not against the state defending the country against the Russians, which is, you know, the central issue for everybody right now. Another story that actually Chris Parker, who's a journalist who's in the Ukraine Solidarity Network, told, which I think is worth repeating, is that, you know, in the army, you have right wingers, you have left wingers. And he talked to some anarchists in Odessa who had been in armed forces, and he said they would have discussions when they were away from the front, and they get very heated between the left and the right. In fact, one of them got in a fist fight with the right winger. But he said when they go back to the trenches, they're all on the same team, and they defend each other because, I mean, that's unit cohesion in the military. That's, you know, kind of standard. But also, they all understand that whatever the other political differences they have, they agree that they got to keep the Russians from taking more of Ukraine. So that's what I can tell you about attitudes.
Do you want to tackle Sam's question about what world situation might be able to have an impact on Putin?
Well, that's, you know, I think Ilya might have a better grasp of, you know, how the Russian people would respond. I mean, what I thought of when Sam said that was there are increasing calls in Ukraine to move for elections. Socialny Ruk has called for that across the political spectrum. It feels like people want to have a say, and there's a lot of discontent with the Rada that's there. A lot of those people have, you know, left their posts in the parliament. There's a lot of unhappiness about the mobilization and about the neoliberal reforms, at least from the left. So that, you know, it feels like, from what I could see, you know, the Ukrainians want to have a say in an election pretty soon. As far as, you know, the kind of revolutionary upheaval that the workers in Kryvyi Rih were talking about, I don't know how much that was their wishful thinking or just their gut feelings about things and how widespread that is. That was, you know, that was just one place, a bunch of lefties. So it's hard to generalize from that.
Ilya, would you like to comment, especially on the burning question? How can this ever end?
Sorry, I don't have a clear answer on this question. So probably I would firstly comment a bit about the question of the Russian language. in Ukraine and probably in the post-Soviet countries in general, because definitely for Ukraine, from the very beginning, the question of the Russian language or Russian-speaking minority or whatever, it was a political question, because the let's say the distinction between Russian and Ukrainian was a question, always was a question of self-identity. Yes, so for example, now in Russia you have a lot of top officials in Putin's state who are ethnically Ukrainians, who were born in Ukraine, who spent a big time of their life there, and now these people they are involved in the destruction of their own country because they align themselves with, let's say, Russian state, and they define themselves as Russians. So the question of language in Ukraine became politicized, and that's why it's really hard. It's really hard now to identify yourself as Russian-speaking Ukrainian, for example, in Ukraine. And unfortunately, in the situation of ongoing war conflict, it's very hard to say that okay, we hate Russia as a state, but we don't feel bad about being Russian or speaking Russian. So definitely, if the question of language, the question of identity was politicized and let's say militarized by the Russian state, the answer from Ukrainian state, which is trying to defend its independence, sometimes also let's say politicize these questions as well. So you can say that now there is a problem to use Russian language publicly in Ukraine. That's true. So this tendency started from 2014, from the annexation of Crimea and the Russian military involvement in Donbass, which was designed as the defense of the Russian-speaking population. And of course, the answer in many ways was also nationalist, and it's also came in the form of some discrimination of the Russian language. But unfortunately, I think that it's inevitable process, inevitable answer in this situation. So we are living in the world where you have the national states, the bourgeois national states, who are trying to defend from the bourgeois reactionary empires. So that's why the very logic of the bourgeois national state is still there.
We have a few more minutes, so if there are one or two questions, I think we would have room for them. But I don't see a hand. Yes, David?
Okay, well, I guess I could try to take a shot at this question of what in the international situation could bring about an end to this. And, you know, when Howie and Ilya don't have answers, it's quite clear that it is very, very difficult to imagine. And I could make an analogy. I mean, it seems to me that barring an implosion of the Russian regime, which I suppose is not inconceivable, but very, very unlikely in the foreseeable future, to bring about a solution which would require something like the United States and China getting together to impose terms on Russia and Ukraine. I'm not saying that would be progressive or anything, but you have to imagine something like that. And that doesn't seem in the cards. I mean, as much as Trump might like to get a Nobel Peace Prize, it does not seem like something like that would happen. Now, the analogy, and it's a very different situation, but the analogy that comes to my mind is Israel and Palestine, which is equally intractable. Since the goal of the Israeli state and historically of the Zionist movement is to get rid of the Palestinian population, and despite the genocide in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and so on, the Palestinian population is not going away, and so therefore, again, barring some revolutionary outcome, which is very difficult to foresee, there would have to be some combination of forces that would impose a solution on Israel, which again seems remote. So it's not like I have an answer to the question that Howie and Ilya can't answer. But just I think the analogy shows how intractable some of these things can be. That imperialism can create situations for which it doesn't, can create problems for which it doesn't have a solution.
Peter?
I've certainly enjoyed the presentations, and mainly I wanted to listen because I wasn't sure where the discussion would go, and I've written a fair amount on this in both Solidarity and Tempest. But this last bit was sort of too tempting, so I want to say something. It seems to me that what David Finkel was talking about with regard to Palestine, that is a revolution of some sort, which I think an Arab revolution is the most obvious, the most likely possibility. That could blow things apart, change the parameters, break the U.S. backing for Israel and force concessions from Israel and possibly more than that. But, and I think it is important that socialists, revolutionary socialists, talk about that kind of solution in the absence of any other solution as being, that's it, that's what would have to happen. Apart from that, I really don't see a solution for Palestine, or at least not a progressive solution. Somewhat similar, I think, in Russia and Ukraine. It seems to me that a revolutionary movement in Ukraine and in Russia, or even just in Ukraine, which would then provoke something in Russia, could make a very big difference. Short of that, I don't see any good solution to it. What I'm seeing being, I think, realistic is that Russia is making slow progress in Donetsk, not enough so that they can conquer Ukraine by any means, but enough so that they can probably take most of Western Donetsk, which has been their objective for since May of 2022, when they failed to take Ukraine as a whole. I think they can achieve that. However, they will have so destroyed both Russia and Ukraine that I think that will lead to a mutual exhaustion and some kind of a ceasefire. It won't be a just peace, it won't be a permanent peace, but it seems to me that mutual exhaustion and a ceasefire a bit to the west of the current front lines is the most likely outcome. It's not a good outcome, but it seems to me that's where things are headed, unless there's some kind of mass movement in Ukraine and Russia or both that that changes the parameters. That's an opinion, and I didn't want to particularly introduce it into this discussion because I wanted to hear what the speakers had to say, but I do want to say that, so I'll stop.
Alamich?
Yeah, I've spoken almost enough here, so I probably will try to keep my comments short. But in reference to David's comments about international relationships and how they could impact the Ukraine-Russian struggle, one of the things that I find interesting is that some of the people on Trump's team, his foreign policy team, actually are sounding more of the alarm around China in reference to Russia. That is, their opinion is that, and not all of them, but some of them are saying that if we don't defend Ukraine and stop Russia, America will be perceived as the weak party in the relationship, and therefore Xi will be more likely to go for Taiwan, because in the way that Russia went for Ukraine, that they'll feel that militarily that it can actually accomplish it, because if they wait too long, and the Naval Fifth Fleet is strengthened more in the Pacific, they'll never be able to get Taiwan. So this is a calculation I've heard that's being thought about in foreign policy circles, which has to do with the relative strengths and weaknesses of military action to seize territory. Now, it's pretty clear, I think we all know, that Russia decided to go into Ukraine because of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, because of the inability to respond to Crimea, the inability to respond to Georgia, all the prior invasions that Russia had done. Putin just figured, okay, well, fine, we can go do Ukraine because the West is not going to do anything about it. It was a miscalculation, obviously, but nonetheless, this idea, I know we don't like to think about this, but this idea of macho strength, and kind of who's waving the big appendage or not, is a driver of a lot of foreign policy. And I think that this idea of kind of this muscular masculinity, this kind of rabid, toxic masculinity, defines a lot of the perception of what's possible and what's not. And so I guess, and maybe this is more directed at Ilya's comments, I'm interested in the possibility that Trump actually may flip around from what we think he's going to do, because his idea of weakness will be expanded upon by Putin. That is, he'll be perceived as weak, that Putin will get over on him, and that therefore, to be a strong man, he has to show Putin that he's boss. And that could change the equation for the Ukrainians. And maybe you could address that in reference to how much of that's a fantasy, how much of that's probable, and how much of it's also deeply connected to the role of Xi in China, and also, I should say, North Korea as well, because the North Koreans are being destroyed on the battlefield, and cannot really provide any relevant military force for Russia.
So this is final comments from Ilya and Howie. Ilya,
Hey,
want to go first?
Art Young's got his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did not see you, Art. Please come in with your question or comment.
Okay, is my mic working? Is my mic working?
Yes.
And
Yes, your
hear
mic
me?
is working.
Sorry?
Yes, it is working.
Okay. I also came to listen, but the turn of the discussion makes me want to comment on something, and I'm not going to offer any answers to the question, but pose it in a different framework. One of the most troubling aspects of the world that we're heading into is that I think what we're seeing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and with the genocide in Palestine are two reflections. There are other similar genocide invasions in the world, but these two are very central. Is part of a global process of breakdown of the old world order and the new struggle for spheres of influence between declining powers and rising powers that seems to be an inevitable and unstoppable aspect of the new world order for various reasons we're pretty much all aware of. Now, with that also comes the breakup of old regimes, such as what we've seen in Syria, and action from below. But the large battalions, the ones with nukes and armies of hundreds of thousands that dominate the geopolitical scene, the process of breakdown and the process of grab what you can from the rising powers or the ones that think they are the rising powers, and to a degree, the US and its allies trying to slow down the process of decline, geopolitically speaking, by getting out ahead of the militaristic pack. For example, I mean, the spheres of influence issue is very clear in terms of Russia and Ukraine, but consequences for a Russian victory or Russian defeat are quite clear. But I think it's also essential, I'll just finish with this, that what's involved in the genocide in Palestine is primarily the US acting through Israel to consolidate its hold on the Middle East and its resources to meet the rising Chinese and other challenges in the region. And I think there are a lot of ways this can go in the short or medium term, but I think what we have to grasp is that these are very deep and long-term processes. We could, for example, be looking at the changes taking place in Africa across above all the sub-Saharan region of Africa, where there's a real changing of the guard. The French are pretty much gone. The Americans have their own. I'll stop there. You see the direction. I think we have to see all of these questions as not exclusively, but as part of a very dangerous geopolitical major transformations that are deeply rooted and likely to be going on for quite some time. Anyway, it's a quick take.
Thanks, Art, and all of the people who raised questions and had comments. It seems so much, many of us are reminded of pre-World War I in terms of imperialisms and rising and declines. So with that, Ilya, do you want to take us out, and then we'll end with Howie?
Yes, so probably I want to thank you all for this discussion and for these questions. There are too many to answer in the proper way. The only thing I think that it's very unproductive to compare the war in Ukraine with situation in Palestine, because I think the solution like looks very clear and very simple in this case. So Russian troops just have to leave Ukrainian territory, and that's a very simple answer of what should be done to end this conflict. So that's why the main problem is the real, let's say, current balance of powers, which leave no room not just for Ukraine, but for like small nations, like in general, because you have some new like principle of international politics coming with people like Putin or Trump, and that's the idea of elimination of any let's say universal rights as the principle of global politics, and especially the right for the self-determination, for any nation to have their own state. So that's why I think it's so important to to continue to talk, to emphasize this right, because it's the only real base for countries like Ukraine to survive in in this world, because any sort of the deal that could be reached between global powers, between Russia or China or US, about the future of small countries like Ukraine couldn't guarantee any security for these countries in the future, unfortunately. So that's why I don't believe in any sustainable deal between these global powers, which could bring stability and independence and self-determination for countries like Ukraine or Georgia.
Howie?
Well, this discussion brings me back to Taras Billis, who has written all these articles about how the left should lead in reforming or rebuilding an international security order that protects human rights and the right to self-determination and international law. And it was interesting because I heard that not just from Taras, although he's elaborated it in several articles, but like I met with the Ukrainian Greens. And their whole discussion is the Greens in Western Europe just criticized Russia's invasion. They need to come up with a positive alternative in terms of a security structure so this can't happen in the future, and the international community will stop it. And one of the things that struck me throughout this whole period since the full-scale invasion is the East European left is really focused on this question. And I found that, the discussion I heard from the East European Alliance for the People on the Planet, the sort of eco-socialist wing of the left parties of Europe, they were focused on that too. So, to me, I know Taras is depressed and, we're looking at how, bad it looks, but I think we have a task on the left to come up with a vision and then a strategy for getting some power so that we can implement it. Because if we leave it to the empires, they're going to kill us all because they got the nukes.
So I have a couple of announcements. Before we go, I just wanted to remind people that the January-February issue of Against the Current is out, both in the print issue and online. Lots of interesting articles in there, and the editorial is The Chaos Known and Unknown. And the second thing is, if you haven't signed up for the Solidarity Monthly newsletter, do so. That's a way of keeping in touch and finding out about other events. And just the last one is the importance that we've established the Ukraine Solidarity Network. It exists, and it's a small force, but it's an important force. And I thank everyone for coming this evening, and especially for the presenters. I think it was what everybody wanted it to be, a place where we could really listen, because listening is really the first task of the revolution before we begin to decide our action plan. Thanks, everybody, for the interesting discussion, and good night.